With us now, let's bring a distinguished professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center and economic columnist for the New York Times, Paul Krugman. He, of course, is the recipient of the 2008 Nobel Prize in Economics.
Wow.
Something that Willie and I never have gotten.
You don't have that.
No, we can tell you about dog track racing, though. Also, author of the new book, Arguing with Zombies. I'm one of those. Economics, Politics, and the Fight for a Better Future. Professor, thank you so much for being with us. We greatly appreciate it. I'm really excited to have your input on how you think we get through this. We've had some of the best medical thinkers in the world talking about how we thread the needle health-wise. How do we do that when it comes to an economy where so many Americans are hurting and so many more are going to be facing tough times in the years and months ahead?
Well, at this point, I mean, it does not look, as best I can make out from the epidemiology, it does not look as if we are in a position to really fully reopen, get anywhere close to fully reopening. We really have to maintain. I've been saying that the economy is in kind of a medically induced coma, where you have to shut down a bunch of functions to give the patient a chance to recover, and that's going to go on for some time. That does not have to be associated with extreme hardship. A lot of people have lost their incomes, but we can make up a lot of that. And in fact, some of the legislation that Congress has already passed does that. We have, on paper, we have greatly enhanced unemployment benefits, enough to make sure that workers who have lost their jobs because of the coronavirus are not in extreme financial hardship. We have a small business lending program that is supposed to be helping businesses survive. What we have now is really, there are two things. We have huge problems of implementation. We have these relief programs, which are the right thing to do, but a lot of the money is just not making its way through. It's being run through state unemployment offices that are completely overwhelmed. They just are not able to handle the load, and in many cases, they were sort of designed to deny unemployment benefits, and so they're not ready to deal with a situation where that's not what you want to be doing. And the small business program has been kind of a disaster. It's been allocated in such a way that lots of companies that should be getting relief are not getting it, and many who shouldn't are getting it. And so, and then state and local governments are facing a huge fiscal crisis. So we know what to do. I mean, we can live. I mean, we can live with an economy that is partially shut down for an extended period of time, but only if we make life tolerable for those who, basically workers who can't work for the time being.
So, we had a discussion a few days ago on the phone for a few minutes, and you brought up a fascinating point. And it happened, we were talking about this at the same time that Mitch McConnell and Governor Cuomo were having this back and forth about what states give more, what states take more. But you actually say that when you look at the state and local government suffering, you fear that it's going to not be the states like New York and Connecticut, New Jersey, and California who get a lot of their money from income tax, but you actually fear that red states, states like Florida that don't have the state income tax are going to be the ones who suffer the most. Could you explain why?
Yeah, so let's think about who is. I mean, we're still trying to make estimates, and there's a lot of detail, too much detail in all of this. But if you ask, who is still whole, who is not actually suffering financially from this, it tends to be well-paid white-collar workers who can work from home. It tends to be people who are pay a lot of the income tax in this country, and states like, so if you look at the four biggest states in America, 2 are blue states, 2 are red states. California and New York are both heavily dependent upon income tax revenue. And a lot of that money is going to keep coming in because people like me can work from home, are still drawing a salary, are doing fine. The Florida and Texas rely almost entirely on sales taxes. And as we know, we just got the report yesterday, consumer spending has fallen off a cliff. And that means a drastic reduction in sales tax revenue. So it's quite possible. Anyone who thinks that the fiscal crises are because states were irresponsible. That's, we can argue back and forth about all of that, but any rainy day fund that anybody established is trivial, rounding error compared with the scale of this crisis. Nobody could have been prepared for it. And if you actually ask who's going to suffer the biggest declines in revenue, it certainly will include a number of states that are red states, are Republican, and may well actually be worse in some of the red states than it is in some of the high white collar employment blue states.
Professor Krugman, it's Willie Geist. Good to have you on this morning. You've looked at all the data that we've seen publicly. The first quarter, the economy contracted almost 5%. That will be much bigger. Yeah. Of course, in the second quarter, we saw new jobless claims yesterday at 3.85 million, 30 million jobless claims over the last 6 weeks. As you look out over the horizon, what begins to sort of thwart this momentum, if you want to call it that, toward massive unemployment and massive contraction in the economy? Where are the hopeful signs over the horizon?
Well, first of all, the good news is that so far, we think most of the jobs are really not a conventional recession. Most of them it's social distancing, it's this induced coma. And we are seeing only a few signs of it spilling over to the broader economy. We came very close in March to a financial crisis, which would have been an absolute disaster. That would have been Great Depression. But the Federal Reserve threw a lot of money at the markets and stabilized that. So that's actually kind of okay on that front. And we are doing a lot of relief. It's not remotely enough, but all of this unemployment benefits, small business lending, it's not going to bring back jobs in lockdown sectors of the economy, but it is going to limit the job losses more broadly. Now, I think we're almost surely headed for an unemployment rate close to 20%, maybe above, and that is Great Depression level unemployment. That's comparable to the worst years of the Great Depression, but it does not look at the moment like it's going to spiral into a complete collapse. The problem is it's at the moment it's extremely painful for people who have lost their incomes.
Professor, let's talk about your book, Arguing with Zombies, and talk about what the purpose of this book is, and what you hope people will get out of it.
Okay, the book is some new material, a lot of things I've written over the years, but it all is telling a story. If you look at American politics, look at the debates, mostly about economic policy, though there are some other issues I deal with. We'd like to imagine, our civics textbooks tell us that we have serious discussion of ideas, people have different views, people may have different values, but we do have good faith discussion, and we make a decision based upon what we think, how the world works. Unfortunately, that's not what happens. In America, in the year 2020, most of our debate is between defensible ideas and things that we know are false, ideas that should have been killed by evidence, but still keep on shambling along, eating our brains, which is why I call them zombies. So the idea that tax cuts pay for themselves, that's been tested to destruction many times. It never works. And yet it's the reigning orthodoxy in the Republican Party. The idea that running budget deficits in a depressed economy is going to lead to disaster and hyperinflation. We saw, there were a lot of people who were predicting that 10 years ago. It didn't happen. They seem to have learned nothing, and you have an amazing amount of the mail I get a lot is people saying, "Aren't we about to have a hyperinflation?" And the answer is no. That's a zombie idea. That's something that is not true. So, and I thought it was important to have a book that says, look, to be honest with our readers, to be honest with the public, it's not just enough to say, here's the way, here's what works, here's what's right, but also to acknowledge the reality of our political discourse, which is not healthy, where in many cases the main debates are not with good faith people who are arguing based on the evidence, but with people who are just clinging to these ideas that, for whatever reason, financial gain ideology, they insist on repeating, even though we know that they're not true.
So I've been one of those zombies on the deficit and the debt. I've been very concerned about it for 25 years. And been concerned and been repeating that the United States is going to have a hard time absorbing a $10 trillion national debt. 15. We're at 23 trillion. We're going to no telling how high we're going to go up. I'm still concerned about that. If you could explain, one, why I should not be concerned about that, but also I would just want to push you a little bit, like you probably push students in your class, and just ask, is there a number? Is there a percentage of our GDP that we could approach that would be a problem? And let's go ahead and assume, as you talked about in a recent column, that we're running basically at 0% interest. So that certainly gives us far more latitude than, say, if interest rates were 10 or 12%. Is there an upper ceiling that our policymakers, that you would warn our policymakers against going to, is in terms of a percentage of America's GDP?
Okay, so the first point is, as you just said, we're able to borrow money at extremely low interest rates. So if you ask what is the future burden on the budget that will be created by the borrowing we're doing now, the answer is it'll be negligible. It'll be a rounding error in the budget. It's just not going to matter. So the headline debt number will be gigantic. Of course, all numbers involving the U.S. are gigantic, but even as a percentage of GDP, we are going to end up very shortly with debt that's higher as a ratio of GDP than at the end of World War II. But everything we've seen says that advanced countries that borrow in their own currency, like the United States or Japan or Britain, are able to carry really very high debt loads without crisis. And a lot of that is because interest rates, even when interest rates aren't as low as they are now, interest rates are consistently below the growth rate of the economy, which actually means that debt tends to melt away over time relative to GDP, as long as you aren't, massively irresponsible year after year. Probably there must, in principle, be some limit. But if you look at the historical record, it's very hard to find it. I mean, Japan has debt that's 200% of GDP, no problems. They're able to borrow very cheaply. In fact, negative interest rates in Japan at the moment. Britain, we came out of World War II with debt that was about 100% of GDP, which at the time people thought was terrible, but turned out to be no problem at all, and it just sort of melted away. We never paid that debt back. We just grew out of it. Britain came out of World War II with debt that was 270% of GDP. They had no problem. They grew out of their debt too. By 30 years later, it was down to just 50% of GDP. So if there is an upper limit, I mean, that's almost a philosophical question, because if there is an upper limit, it's so far away from where we are that it shouldn't bear on our policy decisions at all right now.
Yeah, and as you've also said, the fact that the United States can borrow against its own currency, also helpful. The new book is Arguing with Zombies: Economics, Politics, and the Fight for a Better Future. Professor Krugman, thank you so much for being with us. Hope you'll come back. Be safe.
Thanks.
All right.
I will do my best.
Okay.
Still ahead, it's the start of a new month, and several states across the country are now easing up on coronavirus restrictions. But Dr. Anthony Fauci has a warning, saying you can't just leap over things. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.